So just to quickly go over the methods, my methods chapter was super long, but I'll make it real quick for this. So for my data collection, I collected cases of intimate partner homicide from 1995 to 2022, where the defendant was found guilty and then sentenced. To do this, I used several legal databases to collect the data, as listed there. This resulted in 176 cases, 48 being female perpetrated and 128 being male perpetrated cases. You'll notice that there's quite a gap there, but it actually is very corresponds to the national prevalence in Canada, percentage-wise. From these cases, I decided to use a bivariate analysis to decide which factors to consider in the multivariate analyses. I originally had over 60 variables that I collected. Most of them were not significant, which I found very interesting. So I only used the significant at the bivariate level to include in the regression, just to make sure that the fit was nice and correct. And then I used two types of multivariate analyses. I used linear and logistic regression. Logistic regression I used for conviction level, so whether they were convicted of manslaughter or murder, and then linear for sentence length. The next slide. For the sake of time, I will be just going over right into the multivariate results. I'm not going to go over the bivariate results at all. But just keep in mind that I only included factors that were bivariate or significant at the bivariate level on the side there. It's very small, so don't try and read it. So first, my analysis was of conviction level, which is again whether an individual is convicted of manslaughter or murder, resulted in 5 significant variables that either increased or decreased the likelihood of being convicted of murder. Next slide. So the primary independent variable, which is a combination of indigeneity and gender, shows that Indigenous male and female defendants, as well as non-Indigenous female defendants, have a lower likelihood of being convicted of murder compared to non-Indigenous male defendants, where they were more likely to be convicted of murder compared to manslaughter. Next slide. Second, I found that individuals who proceeded by trial compared to pleading guilty in the court had almost 6 times higher likelihood of being convicted of murder compared to manslaughter. And next slide. Next, individuals who used a weapon during the offense had an almost 4 times higher likelihood of being convicted of murder compared to manslaughter. Next slide. And then finally, for both provocation and intoxication, those who were provoked or intoxicated during the offense had a much lower likelihood of being convicted of murder compared to manslaughter. And then now onto the linear regression results with sentence length. So again, there was 5 variables that were significantly related to the results of whether an individual had a higher or lower sentence. And then you can just click all through them and I'll just. So again, here's the 4 variables. I'll save the primary variable till after this slide. So first, defendants who had a history of abusing their partner, whether it was primarily physical that was discussed, but also controlling behavior or psychological abuse was also included, were associated with longer sentences than those who had no history of abuse against their partner. Next is final conviction. So those who were convicted of murder were associated with higher sentences than those convicted of manslaughter. Next is the circumstances of the offense. So those with aggravating case circumstances. So if the judge noted the murder as being particularly brutal or heinous, they were more likely to have higher sentence length than those who did not have a brutal or heinous murder. And lastly, this was the only variable that was found to lower an individual's sentence length, which was remorse. So the presence of remorse was associated with lower sentences than those who were noted as not having remorse. And then next slide. So now onto the primary independent variable, and you can just click right through it. I thought I was going to be clicking, so it's a little, and then I think there's one more at the end. Yeah, there you go. So first, Indigenous and non-Indigenous males are associated with more severe sentences compared to Indigenous and non-Indigenous female defendants. Next, non-Indigenous females are associated with more severe sentences than Indigenous female defendants, but to a lesser degree than male defendants. And then finally, while Indigenous and non-Indigenous women are sentenced differently, Indigenous and non-Indigenous men are sentenced similarly. So there's no significant difference between the two. And next slide. I think I just hit it again. Arrow. So if we were to put this into a sort of a hierarchical model, the most severely sentenced defendants were Indigenous and non-Indigenous males, followed by non-Indigenous female defendants, and then finally Indigenous female defendants. Yeah. Okay. And so just to summarize my results, individuals who are non-Indigenous males preceded by trial, use a weapon, and are not intoxicated or provoked have an increased likelihood of being convicted of murder compared to manslaughter. For sentence length, individuals who are male, have a history of violence against their partner, have aggravating case circumstances, are convicted of murder compared to manslaughter, and are not remorseful for the homicide, are positively associated with more severe sentences. And the next slide. So in my thesis, I have a long discussion of why I think all these things are occurring and what I think they do to sentence length. But just for the sake of time, I will just go over sort of my main findings and the implications of this research. So the first implication of the findings is that men were sentenced more severely than women, and Indigenous men were sentenced the same as non-Indigenous men. So while it may seem obvious based on my variables that I found significant, that of course men would be sentenced more severely than women, but we have to remember that I held in terms of regression, I held all variables constant. So they were on the same level and still gender was still significant. And then in the case of Indigenous men being sentenced the same as non-Indigenous men, this is particularly concerning as in theory, due to practices in our legal system, especially with Ladue, Indigenous men and non-Indigenous men would likely have a difference in sentences, similar to Indigenous women and non-Indigenous women, but there was no difference between the two. So from that, the study also indicates that disparity may arise across all levels of sentencing, such as plea bargaining, charge reductions, police interactions, jury deliberations, and several other, essentially all levels of sentencing. So for example, in this study, female defendants received an overall charge reduction of 69% for second degree and 50% of first degree charges to manslaughter charges or convictions. And out of these reductions, 71.4% of them were due to a guilty plea. But for male defendants, the charge reduction rate was 32% for first and secondary convictions, with only 45% being due to a guilty plea. So considering the demonstrated role of guilty pleas and final conviction in relation to sentence severity, this is one of many examples of why disparity exists across multiple levels of sentencing process. So just for future research, this area should focus a lot on the qualitative aspects of the cases, especially of these sentencing documents. I originally planned to do that in my master's, but quickly found out that 3 months of writing is not enough time to do a full qualitative analysis. So I just focused on the quantitative this time around, but I will likely get to the qualitative aspects as well, just to mainly see the extent of this disparity and whether if there's something more I can tease out of the cases as well. And then as well, the examination of Indigenous men in Gladue in the context of partner homicide sentencing should be explored further, just based on the significant finding of the non-significant difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous men. I believe that is all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's a lot of good and hard work. I would like to ask you to say more about this, the importance of the non-significant difference between the Indigenous men and the other, because I didn't quite follow. I don't understand what it all means.
So in Canadian sentencing, we have what is known as Gladue principles, or a lot of Gladue reports. So in sentencing in Canadian law, you're supposed to have special consideration for the circumstances of Indigenous peoples. And what I found is that while the female defendants that were Indigenous had extensive GLADU reports and GLADU considerations, the male defendants that were also Indigenous did not have the same extent to which they were considered. And I found this within the quantitative aspects where it was clear that Indigenous women were sentenced less severely than non-Indigenous women, even though many had similar case circumstances. But the GLADU report was able to emphasize rehabilitation, perhaps lowered the case severity overall. But with the men, I think a significant aspect of it is that every Indigenous man in my sample killed an Indigenous woman, every single one of them. There's about 24. And in the criminal code, there is a provision where if you kill a Indigenous woman, it's more complicated than what I'm saying, but essentially, if you kill an individual who is Indigenous and a woman, you need to consider, the judge needs to consider deterrence and denunciation as the primary objective of sentencing. So of course, deterrence and denunciation inevitably increases sentences for the sake of deterring others from doing similar things. So the significance there is that from what I've seen, GLADU is being mitigated for Indigenous males, essentially not being effective at all. So if we want to help Indigenous people, especially in terms of the criminal justice overrepresentation, GLADU needs to be considered. It needs to be actually applied. So when it's not, it's a huge issue. And it becomes an issue of balancing the right of women and the right of Indigenous peoples, which is a very political topic as well. Mm-hmm. Actually, I did discuss it in my actual thesis. I made a recommendation that there should be an amendment to the criminal code that considers Indigenous men who kill Indigenous women. There should be a special consideration there, which will, it comes as a very controversial statement because it sounds like I'm diminishing the killing of Indigenous women at the hands of Indigenous men, but I'm not at all. I'm even supported by the Native Women's Association of Canada. Indigenous men need to be considered for rehabilitation. They need to be considered as people who are also victims of colonization, very similar to Indigenous women. So I think an amendment needs to be made, and they need to be considered the effects of those provisions instead of just kind of throwing away the key. They'll get out some point, but who cares for now? So I think it is a huge issue. And if you'd like, I can send you my thesis, which discusses it at length. I could talk about this all day, but I feel like I'm cutting into time. Yeah. Mhm. A lot of them were not. Are you talking about just every case or? A lot of times, unfortunately, they weren't first-time offenders. There was some cases involving like prior violence, but it also was present within the Indigenous women population as well. But it was considered differently. And I did statistically control for all those variables, but they were still significantly different. Yeah.